We have an absolutely massive and highly urgent breaking weather alert for you right now coming directly out of northern Michigan, where the highly populated communities of Cheboygan County are currently being violently battered by a completely unprecedented and incredibly dangerous flooding emergency today. Emergency management officials are operating on the absolute highest possible level of maximum alert, as terrifying live video footage currently flooding social media platforms shows completely massive, highly destructive floodwaters violently ripping directly through heavily traveled suburban communities. Yeah, the sheer absolute magnitude of this completely terrifying natural disaster is absolutely staggering, as highly dramatic elevated camera angles and raw user-generated cell phone videos directly from the heavily impacted region show completely massive stretches of normally quiet residential neighborhoods actively transformed into violently heavily flooded muddy lakes. Entire completely massive neighborhoods have been violently physically isolated, turning individual family homes into completely stranded, deeply vulnerable islands, as the incredibly heavy, murky water makes it absolutely logically impossible to actively determine exactly where the paved road officially ends and the heavily swollen river actually begins. To truly comprehend the absolute massive scale of this terrifying natural disaster, you must closely actively look at the incredibly highly dangerous atmospheric combination currently aggressively driving this completely massive extreme weather crisis. The entire northern region was recently completely heavily blasted by massive brutal winter snowstorms for several incredibly agonizing months, and now aggressively rapidly warming spring temperatures combined with multiple violent rounds of completely heavy torrential rain are actively forcing all of that thick, massive snowpack to violently melt at a completely alarming rate. This completely catastrophic toxic recipe of completely heavy, relentless rain violently falling directly on top of massive, deeply frozen ground means the fast-moving, massive water has absolutely nowhere safe to naturally drain. Deeply exhausted local homeowners in Cheboygan are currently waking up completely surrounded by incredibly highly dangerous rising floodwaters that have violently aggressively transformed their once incredibly peaceful properties into completely unrecognizable, rapidly flowing deep water disaster zones, forcing thousands to immediately forcefully evacuate. And on the completely incredibly heartbreaking, massive emotional toll is heavily actively rising by the exact minute, as thousands of deeply hardworking Michigan families completely hopelessly watch their absolute most heavily cherished personal possessions violently completely float away right in front of their very own eyes. Local news crews actively completely on the ground spoke directly with deeply terrified local homeowners who frantically completely spent several agonizing days desperately aggressively building massive heavy sandbag walls directly in front of their beautiful homes, completely expecting the massive floodwaters to only violently strike from the main riverfront direction. However, the aggressively massive, overwhelming volume of highly dangerous, rapidly moving water completely violently bypassed all of their heavy defensive fortifications actively, violently creeping completely around the back of their properties and aggressively completely surrounding their homes from every single possible angle. Completely heavily exhausted families are now violently, desperately wading through incredibly deeply contaminated toxic floodwaters, carrying basic plastic laundry baskets and heavy trash bags, actively attempting to desperately aggressively salvage absolutely whatever small personal belongings they logically can before completely forcefully evacuating the massive disaster zone entirely.
It's a little wet out here today. Nothing too crazy, you know.
The completely terrifying immediate threat to absolute pure public safety is absolutely far from over, because emergency management teams are now actively, aggressively, completely monitoring the massive, heavily swollen Cheboygan River, where incredibly brave emergency repair crews are desperately, frantically working around the clock to forcefully, physically stabilize a highly vulnerable, massive concrete dam. If this incredibly heavily stressed local dam violently breaches, it would instantly, completely unleash an absolutely catastrophic, massive tidal wave of pure, completely concentrated destruction directly onto the highly populated downstream communities, completely washing away heavy infrastructure and massive passenger vehicles. The violently aggressive weather pattern is also actively creating massive, widespread logistical chaos as heavily frantic local emergency officials actively, deeply urge remaining heavily stranded homeowners to aggressively, tightly tie their massive, heavy explosive propane gas tanks directly to large, sturdy trees to physically prevent them from violently, aggressively floating away and actively creating massive, highly dangerous floating explosive hazards. State Highway Patrol officers are actively, completely, aggressively issuing highly desperate and deeply urgent public safety warnings, violently begging all highly vulnerable residents to completely, strictly avoid all highly unnecessary travel and never ever attempt to forcefully drive through any flooded urban valleys or massive deep water intersections. As the bright, warm sun completely, finally, briefly, painfully peeks through the heavy, dark clouds, the incredibly shocking and deeply, highly frustrating reality for these deeply exhausted local residents is that the massive, highly dangerous floodwaters absolutely, strictly refuse to naturally recede. Families who completely, desperately elevated their incredibly precious personal furniture several vital inches, actively thinking they completely successfully avoided the absolute massive worst of the massive disaster return today, only to absolutely horrifically discover the violently aggressive water had completely continued to heavily, steadily rise, entirely defeating their incredibly desperate preservation efforts. The incredibly shocking and deeply, highly terrifying massive visual reality of violently, heavily rushing floodwaters completely tearing through Cheboygan County serves as a completely massive, deeply terrifying reminder of the absolute pure raw power of our volatile planetary climate today. You absolutely must fundamentally stay completely, highly vigilant and completely, strictly informed as this completely monumental extreme weather crisis actively continues to rapidly, violently develop minute by minute across the massive Midwestern region. Sorry, hit that subscribe button right now, absolutely violently. Smash the notification bell and stay completely, tightly locked to our highly exclusive channel as we continuously, aggressively bring you the absolute latest, highly critical emergency updates directly from the incredibly devastated, flooded communities of northern Michigan.